Hi again, everybody. Well, it's your favorite history teacher with ghost stories again. By the way, I know I'm not your favorite history teacher, so don't even lie. So we're telling stories this time not about ghost schools, but about ghost neighborhoods. Neighborhoods that existed within Toledo that don't exist anymore. Now, I want to be very careful to specify one thing. This is not ghost towns. We're going to get to those later because there used to be different towns where Toledo is. But right now we're going to talk about neighborhoods that most of which existed within the lifetime of your grandparents. And people, you'll hear these names talked about to this day. The ghost towns you never hear of anymore, but the ghost neighborhoods you do. So we're going to spend a little time right now talking about these neighborhoods that formerly existed in Toledo and over time have dissolved. So the first one we're going to talk about is the first one that dissolved, and that's the neighborhood of Presqu'Isle. So it looks like Presque Isle, right? But it was French trappers, which we'll talk about later. This was a French settlement out where the railroad tracks end at Lake Erie. So like Birmingham Elementary is here, the big 280 bridge is here, Waite High School is down here. This is on the east side, but all the way at the north of the east side. And it's out past the refineries and all of that stuff, getting real close to Lake Erie, right across from the point. Okay, so this area called Presqu'Isle is really, really interesting to me. First of all, it was more of an island back then. There's been a lot of landfill over the years to turn this into just another part of the land, a really ugly part of the land out there. But it was an island and it was really close to the lake, which meant you had access over to Canada and up to Michigan. So there was a French settlement out there, hence Presqu'Isle. And Peter Navarre, who's probably one of the most famous early Toledoans, this is where Peter Navarre lived, was out at Presqu'Isle. Over time, shipyards started to move out here because obviously it's great to have a shipyard next to the lake. Today, you and I can't visit Presqu'Isle. Now, there's an Ohio historical marker out at Presqu'Isle, but because of the security zones that they've built around the shipyards, you can't even get to the Ohio historical marker for Presqu'Isle. Which again was home to these French settlers, and before that, we believe was home to an Erie Indian outpost, if not village. Right next to Presqu'Isle was right up here. Just south of Presqu'Isle was an entire neighborhood that existed into your grandparents' lifetime called Ironville. Ironville is one of the kind of like I don't even know how to describe what Ironville is. This was a whole neighborhood that was beloved, that was tight-knit, that had a school and churches and a community, and it's just gone now, like totally wiped off the map. So Ironville exists from the 1850s to 1967 when the last homes are bulldozed for progress. Now, was it a pleasant place to live? Not really. The reason it's called Ironville is because the iron works were out there. Now, as an aside, and we'll talk about this later, the reason the Birmingham neighborhood is called Birmingham, it's named after Birmingham, England, which was where the iron works were there. So all of the northern part of East Toledo was really dedicated to the iron industry back in the day. And kind of a I don't know, historical irony, if you will, is that the biggest building in all of Lucas County is that new steel mill out there at Ironville that is a steel plant. So it's kind of like Ironville has gone back to its roots. Many people who lived in Ironville will tell you about the smell, that it always smelled bad in Ironville because of all the chemical plants and the ironworks, that it was sooty and it smelled. A lot of the people who lived out there were Czech and Slovak. Now, this was, by the 1920s, you had a country called Czechoslovakia. But these were ethnic Czechs and ethnic Slovaks that lived out in Ironville. They were mostly served by a church that the building of which still exists today, called Holy Rosary. And the Holy Rosary Parish today exists on the very edge of East Toledo, right before you get into kind of the industrial wasteland that is Ironville. In the 60s, they plowed over Ironville, and we'll talk about why. There were some big plans made in the 40s to improve Toledo by moving all the industry off the downtown riverfront and out towards the lake. And Ironville The Ironville demolition had a lot to do with that, where they try to improve downtown by demolishing this neighborhood. Of all the neighborhoods we're going to talk about today, it's the only one that's just not in existence. You can drive out there. You can take Front Street all the way to where it dead ends, and it dead ends at Millard Avenue. And then you can take Millard out to like Cedar Point Road if you were going to go out to Maumee Bay. Millard is the only street left from what was a whole neighborhood out there. Little Syria is not called Little Syria anymore, but Little Syria at least still exists, and you can still see some of the buildings that made it an awesome neighborhood. So it was called Little Syria at the time because Syria wasn't just what we think of as the country of Syria in the Middle East today. They called people from all over the east end of the Mediterranean Syrians. Now, they weren't all ethnically Syrians. They were Lebanese, and they were Druze, and they were Palestinians, and they were later Israelis. So not all of these people in Little Syria were Syrian. A lot of them were Lebanese. Lots of them came to the United States in the late 1800s. The Ottoman Empire starts to crumble. It gets crappy over there. There's a draft that a lot of guys are trying to avoid because they don't want to serve in the Ottoman military, and they come over here. When you look around this part of Toledo, and again, this is down, here's Cherry Street, okay? So this would be like Cherry Street up at Huron, Erie, Ontario, Michigan, Champlain. And if you look there and around the edges of it, all of these blue dots are places that were important to people in the Little Syria community. Lots of them were Orthodox Christians and went to Greek Orthodox churches. Even though they weren't ethnically Greek, they went to Greek Orthodox church because that's what was closest to religion at home. So there's St. George's Orthodox Church is right down here. Up here is Toledo's first mosque. It's located up by Popeyes, like across from Popeyes, behind McDonald's. As you get up that way. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a complete blank right now. But the actual like Little Syria neighborhood was basically boundaried by, you can see Magnolia Street there, Mulberry, Chestnut, LaGrange went right through it. And then when you went north of Little Syria, you were into what we sometimes call Polish Village today, was called Lagrinka back in the old days. Lenk Hill, here's a neighborhood I can almost guarantee you've never heard of. If you know where Stewart Elementary is, that is the Lenk Hill, the old Lenk Hill neighborhood. So Lenk Hill is one of the city's oldest neighborhoods. It's founded in 1848. So that the city was barely 10 years old at that point. It was started by a German guy who came here. His family owned breweries back in Germany for beer. He came here and started a brewery. And all of his German buddies kind of moved to this neighborhood called Lenk Hill. Now, this is like Hawley, City Park, Indiana Avenue, Pinewood, going up to Dorr Street, going over to Collingwood over here, coming again as far south as like Avondale, Indiana Avenue, that area. Gradually, Lenk Hill emptied out. And so by the 19-teens, the Germans start moving out of this neighborhood. German people start moving out of the neighborhood. Who did they sell to? Well, the Germans were really the only ethnic group in Toledo that was even marginally cool with the African-American community coming in. And so Lenk Hill gradually becomes Toledo's first historic black neighborhood, which we sometimes call the Pinewood neighborhood or the Dorr Street corridor. And black families start moving up onto Pinewood, and there are some really, really great stories about the early African-American families that move into Lenk Hill and how you had black people drinking with the Germans, drinking German beer with the Germans, and the Germans are still speaking German, and the black people have just come up from the South with really deep Southern accents and stuff. And there's some pretty cool stories from the early days in the 19-teens and 20s as African-American folks moved into the Lenk Hill neighborhood. And basically by the time you get to the 1950s, the Germans are out of Lenk Hill. And when you hear people talk about Lenk Hill today, it's either because they're really old, or they had relatives who lived there, or they're just history nuts like me, because the name's been dead for a long time. Now, Lenk's Hill ends up kind of being the east end of a different neighborhood that's also dead today. And this neighborhood was called Cushvans. Now, the boundaries of Cushvans are argued. If you want to argue with somebody in Toledo, Ohio, argue about the boundaries of a neighborhood. So while I made boundaries here, they are probably not the exact boundaries of Cushvans. So on this end, you have Parkside Boulevard. So here's the Scott Park campus, Calvary Cemetery. Here is Parkside Boulevard, okay? Then down at the bottom, you got the Airline Junction, or some people will argue Swan Creek, that Swan Creek was the real south border of Cushvans. You got Nebraska Avenue going right through the middle of it. Nebraska Avenue is the heart of Cushvans. Hawley Street coming right up the middle, going over to about City Park. Now, as you remember from the last map, this is also Lenk's Hill. Like Hawley to Dorr over to Collingwood was the Lenk's Hill neighborhood. And a lot of Lenk's Hill homes do end up getting bought by Polish people by the 20s, 30s, 40s. And so you really have three major ethnic groups in this neighborhood by the time we get to 1945. You've got the few Germans that are left, a lot of black people who have moved in, and a lot of Polish people who are in this neighborhood. Toledo had two Polish neighborhoods, and you basically had Southside Polish here and Northside Polish up at LaGrange and Central, the Lagrinka neighborhood. A lot of the Polish who live in Cushvans are from a region called Poznan back in Poland that was close to the border with Germany. And so if you look at where people in Cushvans were born or where their parents were born, some of them say Poland, some of them say Germany, but all of these people were ethnically Polish because it was a region that at different times, some points it was part of Poland, some times it was part of Germany, depending on the way the wars were going at the time. It butted up to Lenk's Hill on the east, Scott Park on the west, and then to the south of it was a neighborhood called Darby that we'll talk about in a second. So, Darby was the Irish neighborhood in town, and it was basically centered around Immaculate Conception Church and School, if you guys know where that is on Broadway. The church was sometimes called Darby, the school was sometimes called Darby, and the whole neighborhood was sometimes called Darby. And Darby is, again, one of the really old neighborhoods in Toledo, just like Lenk's Hill. Darby gets its start in the 1850s with Irish workers who had worked on the canal. So when the canal came in the 1830s, 1840s, Irish workers stayed behind. And if you follow the canal all the way out to Defiance, and you look at old cemeteries, you'll find Irish names all along the Maumee River because these Irish were the ones who came in as they were illiterate and they weren't real skilled. They were the ones who came in as the labor to dig ditches, literally. And the Irish who stayed in Toledo at the head of the canal, because the canal came in up here. The canal came into Swan Creek. I'm sorry, where is that? Is that the trail? No, there's the trail. Yeah. So right about here is where the canal hit Swan Creek, and down south of the canal is where the canal workers lived. And if you go through that neighborhood, you will still find streets with names that are kind of Irish in ancestry. Shamrock, Emerald Avenue, so on and so forth, are some of these places down in the old Darby neighborhood, which is today La Honda or Old South End, which is predominantly Hispanic. So that's kind of our introduction to the old dead neighborhoods in Toledo. We will pick this up with the ghost towns later that existed in Proto-Toledo before there was a Toledo. And that's pretty much it. Thanks for sticking with me, guys. And as always, be well.